Now, my question is, you rightly pointed out that bringing Ukraine into NATO is neither interest of the United States nor of the European Union. Nevertheless, it happened. So what, according to you, are the truly driving forces behind this process?
Yeah.
Jonathan Hazlitt has written a book entitled Hubris. That's his answer. What is your answer?
Yeah, it was hubris to some extent, but that doesn't go deep enough. NATO expansion became a serious issue when Bill Clinton moved into the White House. Bill Clinton won the election in '92, and he moved into the White House in January '93. And I believe the decision to expand NATO was finally made in late 1994, okay? And the first tranche of expansion was in 1999. That's when Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary come in. And then the second big tranche was 2004. Now, it's very important to understand two things. One is that Russia was remarkably weak in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s. Vladimir Putin resurrected the Russians from the dead. So you want to understand that when we started NATO expansion in the 90s, it was not designed to contain Russia. Given the world that we live in today, I'm sure lots of people think that NATO expansion, when it started in 1994, was designed to contain Russia, that Russia was seen as a threat. That is not true. What was driving NATO expansion, this gets to my second point, is that we were the unipole. We were the only great power on the planet. And you all understand, in a world where we're the only great power on the planet, there is no great power politics because there's only one great power. So for the first time in our history, we were in a position to pursue a liberal foreign policy. And we pursued a policy that many people call liberal hegemony. We pursued a foreign policy that was designed to remake the world in America's image. And the Europeans went along with us. They were our sidekicks in this enterprise. You want to understand, I talked about the Chinese threat today. We helped create that threat because we helped China to grow more and more powerful economically. And a realist like me said at the time, China is going to translate that economic power into military power, and it's going to try to dominate East Asia to the disadvantage of the United States. Virtually everybody I talked to said, John, you are a dinosaur. Your realist view of international politics is outdated. We live in a new world. China's going to grow economically. It's going to get hooked on capitalism. It's going to get integrated into institutions like the WTO. It's eventually going to turn into a liberal democracy like the Asian tigers did. And we're going to live happily ever after because China's going to look like us and we're the good guys. And if they look like us, the world is filled with good guys. We live happily ever after. That was the belief. That was liberal hegemony applied to China. Now, how does that apply to NATO expansion? What we were doing with NATO expansion, it's a liberal policy. It's not designed to contain Russia. We're taking those institutions like NATO and the EU, and we're expanding or enlarging those institutions. We're moving them eastward, bringing in new members. They will become responsible stakeholders. Furthermore, we're making sure they're all hooked on capitalism, right? Making them economically interdependent. And if everybody's economically interdependent, nobody's going to fight because who would want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? You know, the whole argument. So institutions are spreading eastward. Economic interdependence is spreading eastward. And then, very importantly, the Velvet Revolutions, right, or the color revolutions, the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution, we're going to promote revolutions in Eastern Europe that are designed to turn those countries into pro-Western liberal democracies. And if you create a world that's filled with liberal democracies, you live happily ever after. For many of the younger people in the audience, you're going to think this is hard to believe because in 2025 it makes no sense. But I just want to say a word or two about Frank Fukuyama's very famous article, The End of History, which you should all go read if you haven't read it. It's a terribly important argument because it is the software that was in the heads of European elites and American elites, and is still in the heads of many European and American elites. Frank Fukuyama's argument was that liberal democracy is the future. We liberal democracies have the wind at our back, and there are going to be more and more liberal democracies around the world. And the end result is peace. And in fact, he says at the end of the article that the biggest problem we face going forward is boredom. Boredom. Just think about that. War's off the table. And it's an argument for creating democracy, spreading institutions, and spreading capitalism and fostering economic interdependence. That's what was motivating us. We were not interested in screwing the Russians. Clinton and company in the 90s understood that the Russians were going to protest. There's no question about that. Lots of the planning documents are now available. The Clinton people understood that the Russians were adamantly opposed, but they thought they could buy the Russians off because they thought we were a benign hegemon, right? That's what they thought was going on here. And by the way, just on talking about the color revolutions, we wanted to spread a color revolution to Russia as well. There's an article in the New Yorker about Mike McFaul, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, as I was telling you before, at the time of when the Ukraine crisis broke out in 2014. But you should read, you can Google it, the New Yorker article on Mike McFaul. He was basically trying to foster a color revolution inside of Russia when he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. Needless to say, this made the Russians super angry, and they insisted that he be withdrawn as ambassador. Right. But it just gives you a sense of what's going on here. So it was the fact that we had this deeply embedded liberal foreign policy that got this train out of the station. And it covered the first tranche, 99, the second tranche, 2004. And then it was impossible to stop. Once NATO expansion started, it was just impossible to stop. And it's quite amazing that nobody in the West, except for maybe Trump on occasion, says no more NATO expansion, right? Europeans ought to be saying at this point in time, we've had enough NATO expansion. This has led to enough trouble. We have got to get our house in order. The last thing we want to do is keep provoking the Russians because it's not going to work to our benefit here in Europe. But nobody says that. Or I shouldn't say nobody. Hardly anybody says that. That's certainly not the mainstream view. So I think it's the pursuit of a liberal foreign policy. And by the way, just one more point on this. I talked about engagement with China, how foolish that was. That's liberal hegemony. Second example, expansion of NATO, expansion of the EU, color revolutions, Eastern Europe. That's the second example. The third example is the Middle East, the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine was all about democratizing the Middle East. Again, most people have forgot that. We thought we were going to go into Iraq, knock Iraq off, then, well, maybe we'll do Syria, maybe we'll do Iran next, go in, knock that regime off, going to turn it into a liberal democracy, right? You know, it didn't work out. None of this worked out. The Bush Doctrine, it failed. It crashed and burned in Iraq. China, we created a peer competitor. I'm not sure it's a peer competitor. It may surpass us at one point in the not too distant future, right? And then the whole subject of NATO expansion. This was a thoroughly liberal foreign policy, and it comes out of unipolarity. It comes out of the fact, again, once you go to a world where you have one great power politics by definition is taken off the table. that means that people like me, realists who think of the world in balance of power terms, are going to be put in the closet, they're going to lock the door and keep me there. And the liberals are going to dominate, right? Which is exactly what happened. And now the world has changed. This is the transition, which I think was reflected in Tom's comments and in John's presentation. Going from unipolarity to multipolarity really matters. And that's the world we're in, and it's not going away.
Okay, next question.
Thank you, Professor. It's a real pleasure to hear from you. I was professor of international relations at Portuguese University for 20 years, almost 20 years. So I spent part of my life reading your books and your articles, and kind of lots of books and articles, and Hans Morgan's out, and others. So it's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
But allow me to in a humble and respectful way, to put in question your main argument using your own theory.
Yeah, please
So
do.
I will use offensive realism, and you are the father of offensive realism, not to put in question, but to think about your argument. So your main argument is the Ukrainian war is NATO's fault. So using offensive realism, I think that's what NATO did after the end of the Cold War. So NATO took advantage of the victory in the war, of Russia's weakness, to enlarge to Eastern Europe. So it makes sense in offensive realism perspective. It's rational, and they use the power they had, or NATO used the power they had to enlarge to. So using the Russian weakness to enlarge to Eastern Europe. And doing that, they use power in a way to enlarge their goals, but also to, and I think you said that containment is not a good concept to explain what happened, but deterrence is, and even you wrote that in an article about the nuclear arms, Ukrainian nuclear arms, as an important way to contain, to deterrence of Russia. So, in trying to be more simple, I'm not sure if it's because Ukraine is near to NATO that the war started, but because Ukraine is not in NATO. Because if it was in NATO, like the Baltic states or others, we don't see that in the Baltic states. So I'm not sure, of course, I'm just reflecting about this issue, but I think if the problem is that we will not go until the end, because if they were in NATO, I'm not sure if Russia will do what they did. So the question for you is, do you think that the thought of the beginning of the Ukrainian war is not because NATO enlargement, but because NATO didn't enlarge enough.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. 3 points. I think there's no question if Ukraine was in NATO that the Russians would not have invaded, but Ukraine was not in NATO. Second point is, I don't know how many of you know this, but I wrote a piece in 1993, it was in Foreign Affairs, that said Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons. I don't know how many of you know this, but when the Soviet Union broke apart, four of the new countries had nuclear weapons: Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Belarus and Kazakhstan gave up their nuclear weapons, but Ukraine gave a lot of thought to keeping their nuclear weapons. And I wrote a piece that said Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons because it might need them for a rainy day when the Russians came knocking. Of course, apropos my response to this gentleman here, everybody thought that I was crazy, right? And Bill Clinton in particular has recently said that, and he, of course, Bill Clinton was responsible for making the Ukrainians give up their nuclear weapons. He said that he made a mistake, Clinton did, forcing Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. But I want to deal with the heart and soul of your question, which is directly opposite the argument that this gentleman made, right? Or at least my response to this gentleman. What you're saying is that NATO expansion may have caused the war, but it was done according to the dictates of my theory. NATO expansion is consistent with my theory. It wasn't a liberal foreign policy, as I said to this gentleman, as he's saying. And a number of people make this argument, by the way, and they say that I should adopt this argument because it makes my theory more powerful. I'm conceding to you that my theory didn't really matter. They locked me in the closet. He's saying, no, they acted according to your theory. Let me just make a couple points. One is, my theory says that you can only be a regional hegemon, right? You cannot be a global hegemon. But in other regions of the world, all you want to do is make sure there's no other regional hegemon. That's my Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union argument, okay? And Russia in the 1990s was not a potential regional hegemon. And as you know, I said today, it's not a potential regional hegemon. It's just too weak, right? So according to a strict interpretation of my theory, we actually should have gotten out of Europe, okay? Because there's no potential regional hegemon. We were Godzilla, we could go home. That's point one. But point two is, my theory says states should maximize their relative power. And it's a theory that says you should take advantage of other states at every turn. The name of the game in a system where there's no higher authority and you have to take care of yourself is to be as powerful as possible. And therefore, you look to take advantage of other sides. This is consistent with what you're saying. But it doesn't call for doing stupid things. And one could argue, even let's say my theory applies. We're looking for opportunities. Russia's weak. Let's begin to push. The problem that you face is that there's going to be a blowback. Now, the counter to that is we got away with the first tranche, 1999. We got away with it. We got away with the second tranche, was 2004. But then comes 2008. That's the Bucharest decision. The argument would be, if you're really smart, stop there. You've gotten really quite far, right? Two big tranches of expansion, right? Ukraine and Georgia, it's a bridge too far, or two bridges too far. And you all understand the April 2008 decision said, bring in Ukraine, bring in Georgia. And in August of 2008, there was a war over Georgia, right? That should have been the first harbinger of trouble coming on Ukraine. And you could say a good offensive realist like me should have pushed NATO expansion, right? But should have been well aware that, you're feeling your way around in the dark, but when you run into resistance, stop there. But again, my argument is that there's no potential hegemon, therefore no need to really contain the Russians.